Okay, Parshas Chayei Sarah 117 in the Steinsaltz, 106 in the Art Scroll. What's remarkable about Parshas Chayei Sarah is the enormous detail that is found in this story, in this Parsha. And what I mean by that, as we know, is that some stories in the Torah are given a broader treatment. The focus is just on the important aspects or the most essential aspects of the story. But then we have things that are described in what seems to be extraneous details that seem to be either not critical or less critical to the story. We would have gotten the gist of the story even had it been a shorter story. The best example of that, of course, is the building of the Mishkan. The building of the Mishkan takes up many psukim in the Torah, and it feels somewhat repetitive at points. And obviously there's a lot of discussion on why the Torah provides us so much detail in the Mishkan. In Parshas Chayei Sarah, not only we have one, but we have two stories that go into great length, great detail, seemingly beyond what is necessary to convey the essential point of the story. Two stories, not just one. The first one is the purchase of the Ma'aras HaMachpelah, in which Abraham has to acquire a place to bury his wife Sarah, and the whole back and forth, the handling, as it were, with the Bnei Ches and with Ephron, that Avram has to endure. All of it is spelled out in the Torah in great detail, and seemingly more detail beyond than what we need to know about what Abraham is trying to accomplish. That's detailed story number one. Detailed story number two is the story of finding a wife for Yitzchak. Abraham dispatches his servant to return to Haran in order to find a wife for Yitzchak. And in the course of that story, the servant of Abraham, who we know from elsewhere is named Eliezer, but the servant of Abraham conveys so much detail about what he was instructed and how it played out. He conveys it to Lavan in such great detail, more detail than it seems that is necessary in order to convey the main point of the story. And so obviously it's what to think about. Certainly grabs our attention that we have not one but two stories that are told in such great detail. There's something else, though, that I realized that these two stories have in common: the story of acquiring a burial plot for Sarah and finding a wife for Yitzchak. They are both acquisition stories. They are both stories in which something we're attempting to acquire. In the first story, Avram is acquiring a place to bury his wife Sarah. In the second story, the servant of Abraham is acquiring a wife for Yitzchak. Now, I know that language lands hard on the ears to our contemporary sensibilities, the notion of acquiring someone. But I use that in the sense that in halacha, to marry a woman is to bring her into the man's domain, and so it has an element of acquisition to it. But obviously, that doesn't necessarily mean that the woman is considered like property, God forbid. But so nevertheless, we have these two acquisition stories, and what's interesting about them is that both of them, it's not a matter of acquiring an object. There's a certain mercantile aspect to buying or acquiring something, which I think doesn't fully describe both stories. It's true that Avram is buying a piece of land, But as we'll see in the story, he's not just buying a piece of land. This isn't a simple acquisition of just purchasing to own. There's something much greater going on. And obviously, when it comes to finding a wife for Yitzchak, that notion of acquisition, obviously, it's not just buying to own. It's not just a transaction. There's something deeper going on here than just a simple acquisition. And so for that reason, I think that we can take both of these observations and better understand each story. And the two observations I mean are, number one, they're both told over in great detail, and number two is they're both about acquiring something. Those two observations, I think, will help us understand both stories in a deeper way. So let's take a look at the first story. Vayihiyu Chayei Sarah, page 117 in the Steinsaltz, 106 in the Art Scroll. Vayihiyu Chayei Sarah, Me'ah Shana ve'esrim Shana ve'sheva Shanim, Shnei Chayei Sarah. And it was the days of the lives, I should say, or the lifetime. Rabbi Steinsaltz translates, the lifetime of Sarah was 100 years, 20 years, 7 years, the years of the lives of Sarah. So it's a very repetitive pasuk. Her age is spelled out very broadly. It naturally captures Chazal's attention, and Rashi quotes some ideas that have become famous about how her age is conveyed. But to me, and I say this all the time, the more poetic or the more repetitive a pasuk seems to be, the more it's trying to initiate something important, right? This is a headline. This is a this is setting the tone that something very important is going to happen. That the death of Sarah indicates that an important event is about to happen. And so when I see a pasuk that is somewhat poetically rendered, to me, it's meant to catch our attention and recognize that we're launching into an important event. And so, especially when you have that repetition of Chayei Sarah at the beginning and end of the pasuk, Vayu Chayei Sarah, Chayei Sarah, it's almost like a song of tribute to who Sarah was. There's something dinging on my computer that I just want to pause. Just give me 1 second. I'm sorry. Sorry about that. It was distracting me. So here we have this header pasuk, which is introducing a major event. And it's not to take anything away from the significance of the death of Sarah, but it's to teach us that the death of Sarah is now going to usher in an important event. The death of this matriarch, this great person, now brings about the following event. Vatamas Sarah b'Kiryas Arba hi Chevron be'eretz Canaan. Where did she die? She died in a certain location in Kiryas Arba, which is Chevron in the land of Canaan, which is important to know, again, for what's going to happen. Vayavo Avraham lispod l'Sarah v'liv kosa, and Abraham arrives to eulogize Sarah and to cry for her. Vayakom Avraham me'al pnei meso vayidaber al bnei ches lemor. And then Avram gets up, me'al pnei meso, which is an interesting phrase, right? Me'al pnei meso, what does that mean? He gets up from pnei meso, from before his dead, vayidaber al bnei ches lemor, and speaks to bnei ches. There's a very distinct transition from Sarah's death and Avram's mourning to what's going to now happen. And the fact that it says me'al pnei meso, it could have just said vayakom Avram vayedaber al bnei ches lemor. We would know what that meant. But vayakom Avram me'al pnei meso seems to suggest that there's a very intentional transition from talking about Sarah to now dealing with the repercussions or what's next. And the Torah is shifting our focus now from the death of Sarah to what Abraham now has to do. And the fact that Sarah's name is left out of this pasuk, to me, I never realized this before, but Vayakom Avram al Pnei Meso, right? Abraham gets up from in front of his dead. It seems so sterile. What do you mean his dead? This is Sarah. This is his partner. But yet the pasuk renders it as his dead, as if the Torah is purposely shifting our focus away from Sarah to, again, to something else. And the spotlight now is on Avraham and what he has to do in the wake of Sarah's death. So Vayakom Avraham gets up. There's something new going on here. Right? He doesn't say to them, my wife just died. He doesn't say, behold, Sarah has passed away and I need a place to bury her. He's talking about himself, not in a selfish way, but he's talking about Ger v'soshav anochi imachem. I am a foreigner. I am a resident alien, the way Rabbi Steinsaltz translates it. Imachem, amongst you. Tenuli achuzas kever imachem ve'ekbara mesi milfanai. Give me an achuzas kever among you so that I may bury mesi, again, not Sarah, not my wife, but my dead, milfanai, from in front of me. And I was reading one of the commentaries, I forgot who, that focused on the fact that twice Avraham talks about what's in front of him, right? Vayakom Avram me'al pnei meso. Avram gets up me'al pnei meso, from in front, right? And when he has to bury Sarah, mesi milfanai, from in front of me. So it's there's something very interesting going on here in the way that Abraham is communicating, in the way the Torah presents the way that Abraham is communicating, in that there's some sort of transition that is taking place here. That Abraham recognizes, he intuits that with the death of Sarah, there is an important transition about to happen. And so he has to turn to the people, to the Bnei Ches, and negotiate for a place to bury. Now, let's take a step back for a second and ask just a general question, and that is this story the story of the death of Sarah, or is this story the story of the acquisition of the Maras Machpelah? Now, it's easy to say both, but as I've shown you, the story pivots distinctly away from Sarah and now focuses on Avraham and what Avraham needs to do. And Sarah's name is not mentioned anywhere in the story until the very end. If you take a look, once everything's settled and Avraham is able to purchase the place to bury Sarah, then her name returns. If you turn the page and look at Pasuk Yud Zayin, Pasuk 17, this is the conclusion of the story. This is after the purchase is made between Avraham and Ephron. What happens? Vayakom Sedei Ephron asher b'machpelah asher lifnei Mamre hasodeh v'hame'ora asher bo v'chol ha'etz asher b'sadeh asher b'chol gvulo saviv la'Avraham lemikna le'enei b'nei ches b'chol bo'ei shariro. Vayakom, right? The first word in verse 17, right? Was established, right? This field and everything in the field, including the burial place, including the trees, including the whole thing, was established as Avram's property. Avraham lemikna. Right? So this is the story is over, right? The actions of the story are over, and now the narrator is telling us what just happened, right? We skipped over all the events, all the back and forth between Avraham and the Bnei Ches, and Avram and Ephron, and now that purchase was made, now the Torah tells us, okay, this is what happened. Vayakom Sedei Ephron Sher B'Machpelah. So this is a concluding verse to this whole episode. And again, what's being emphasized, what's the result of this story? The result of this story is that Avram owns a burial place. So it sounds like from verses 17 and 18 at the conclusion of the story that this story was all about Ma'aras HaMachpelah, Avram acquiring an Achuzas Kever, not necessarily about Sarah's death. But then look at Pasuk Yud Tes. V'achrechein kavar Avraham es Sarah ishto el me'oras sedei hamachpelah apnei mamrei Hebron be'eretz Canaan. Oh, so Sarah is mentioned. So now that Avram has acquired this place, this burial place, he buries Sarah. Sarah's name returns to the story. Sarah, who appeared at the very beginning, and then her name was left out. Now her name returns and she is buried. So maybe perhaps looking at verse 19, I will tell you that, maybe at the end of the day, this was a story about Sarah's final resting place. But let's look at the last pasuk in this chapter, pasuk Chaf. And what's so surprising about this pasuk? Vayakom hasadeh v'hame'ara asher bo la'Avraham la'achuzas kever me'ez b'nei ches. What's so surprising about this pasuk is this is almost the exact same thing from verses 17 and 18. Verses 17 and 18 said, Vayakom sadeh Ephron. And now it says again, Vayakom hasadeh v'hame'ara asher bo la'Avraham la'achuzas kever me'ez b'nei ches. This last final pasuk of this episode is clearly teaching us that this story is not about the death of Sarah. The death of Sarah is something that Avraham mourned. Avraham eulogized her and he cried. But that event, but Sarah's death leads into an event that has its own significance. Right, the fact that this story would conclude with Vayakom Hasadeh V'Amara, and that I think clearly shows us what many of the Rishonim picked up upon, and that is that Sarah's death creates a situation in which another stage in Avram's life, another thing that he has to accomplish, is now at the forefront. And so, when the different commentaries look at the detail of this story of Avraham having to purchase and all the back and forth and all the detail, so the Rishonim, sense they pick up on this, the significance of this event, and so you have different opinions like the Ibn Ezra. Ibn Ezra says that the reason why the Torah goes into so much detail about the purchase of Maras HaMachpelah is lahodia ma'alas eretz Yisrael l'chaim u'lamesim, to show you how auspicious, how wonderful the land of Israel is for both the living and the dead. Right? This is the land that Hashem promises to Avram and his descendants, and it is a land that is quite suitable for both the living and the dead. And Ibn Ezra adds, and I see I have a question in the chat, which I'll take in just a second. And the Ibn Ezra adds that it's coming to show that Hashem is fulfilling his promise to Avram. Hashem promises Avraham that he will give him this land. And so this acquisition story shows how Avram now acquires this land. That's the Ibn Ezra. That's Ibn Ezra. Now Ruth just asked me in the chat, why is the Parsha named for Sarah, which indicates a certain significance, and I want to come back to that. I am going to answer that question because I do want to come back to Sarah by the end. And so thank you for that question. That's a very important question. So the Ibn Ezra says those two things: Lodia Malas Eretz Yisrael, L'chaim L'Mesim, and to show that Hashem is fulfilling His promise. The Ramban has a great question on this, on both things, of the Ibn Ezra. The Ramban argues on both accounts with the Ibn Ezra. If this is Malas Eretz Yisrael, what does that even mean, right? Avram could have buried her anywhere, right? What does that show us? That there's something beneficial, as it were, to Eretz Yisrael with regards to the living and the dead. This doesn't show us anything. And not only that, but the Ramban says that the promise of the land to Avraham is something that doesn't take place. Hashem even said to Avraham, it's not going to happen for several generations, right? The promise is fulfilled with Avram's descendants. V'dor revi'i yashuvu heina, right? The fourth generation will return here, Hashem said to Avram. So why would Avram's acquisition of a piece of land, not even the whole thing that Hashem promised him, why does that show that Hashem fulfills His promises? This is not a fulfillment of the promise. The promise was that His children would inherit it. The promise was the whole land, not just a piece that would have to be bought. And so the Ramban offers a different approach, one that to me doesn't seem so fundamental to the story. It seems a little bit incidental. But the Ramban says that this story is coming to teach us that Hashem fulfilled a different promise. Hashem promised Avraham, "V'agadla shemecha," I will make your name great. And so the fact that Avraham is told, "Nasi Elokim ata b'sochenu," that you are a prince of God, a Nasi Elokim, shows that Hashem made good on his promise to make His name great. The Ramban also says that this was a test for Avraham. This is perhaps one of the 10 tests. That's another discussion, whether it's in the 10. But the Ramban also says this was a test for Avraham, that the land that Hashem promised him, he would have to extend great effort and great expense to acquire it. So it's a test of Avram's emunah that Hashem would really make good on His promise of giving him the whole land, even though he has to go through all the trouble of buying it for himself. It's that approach of the Ramban is interesting to me because it seems very similar to the notion that when Avram first comes to the land of Canaan and he has to flee already from famine and go down to Mitzrayim, that was also a test, right? The notion that Avram would be promised this land, but it would be so tenuous and so difficult. The fact that he would have to flee for a famine, and now that he would have to buy a portion of it just to bury Sarah, seems to me to be parallel ideas. Now, even though to me the Ramban's idea that the reason why we're given all this detail is to show that Hashem made good on His promise of making Avram's name great, and they call him the Si Elokim. Now, I said that seems a little incidental, not so fundamental, but I think the Ramban does hint to something which I think is very important to realize, which I think helps us understand this a little bit better. And that is what the Ramban is pointing at is the fact that this story is clearly a stage in the life of Avraham and the history of our people. That whatever promises Hashem has for us, and however they're going to be fulfilled, later on in the future, this is an important transition moment. This is an important moment which is going to advance the story of the bris, the story of the covenant, further. And so that's why I believe we are given so much detail. We're given so much detail because Avram's acquisition of this burial place for Sarah it represents an advancement of the bris, and the fact that it's called an achuzas kever. It's not just called a kever; it's called an achuza. An achuza is something that is that is held onto, that is, it's a heritage. Um, and so I think the fact that it would use the word achuza intensifies the fact, or I should say, emphasizes the fact that Avram finding a place to bury Sarah represents that very significant form of acquisition and connection. This is the establishment of the very first real connections that Avram and his children will have with this land. I mean, obviously, the whole notion of burying someone means that you're putting a very permanent, a very permanent stamp on this place. This is now going to be a place that's going to be visited. This is now going to be a place where, this is where Sarah Imenu is buried, and so therefore, Avraham and everyone who comes from Avraham will feel that sense of connection, and so, a little bit like the Ibn Ezra, who says, this is the fulfillment of the promise. Again, I like the Ramban's question on Ibn Ezra. Nevertheless, I think the Ibn Ezra is headed in the right direction. While I wouldn't necessarily say this is a fulfillment of the promise, it's clearly advancing Avram closer to that promise. He now has a little bit of that land to call his own. That's why he starts by saying, Ger v'soshav anochi imachem. Right? I am a stranger. I am a resident alien in this land, which Hashem promised to me. But so I need a place to bury my dead, and I want it to be a place that will be an achuzas kever. There's a very interesting development that I learned about this year that I want to show you. I just want to mention another question I got from Ruth, which is another excellent question. Does Avram know that Adam and Chava were buried in the same site? I'm not sure how to answer that, I'll be honest, because we know from the Medrash, we know from Chazal that this is the place where Adam and Chava are buried. The fact that it's called Machpelah could indicate, right? It's the place where the pairs are buried. I don't know. My off the cuff answer would be, or observation would be, is that it may be that in wanting this to be an achuzas kever, Avraham intuits, or he knows prophetically, that this place is special, that this place is where Adam and Chava are buried, and so that's why he chooses this particular place. And so I think I really think that medrash could fit in with what we're saying. Okay, so one thing I wanted to show you though within this story and how it develops is, what does Avraham request from the Bnei Ches? Tenu li achuzas kever, verse 5 on page 119 and page 106. Tenu li achuzas kever, give me. What is it? Does Avraham offer a price? Does Avram offer to buy it? It doesn't seem like it. He just says, give me. Right? Tanuli, give it to me. It sounds like he wants a gift. It sounds like he wants it for free. And they say, sure. No one's going to stand in your way. So here the story begins with Avram asking for it for free, and they saying yes. Vayakom Avram vayishtachu la'maretz livnei ches, and he gets up and he bows down. Another vayakom, which is interesting. How many vayakoms appear in this story? Vaydaber itam lemor im yeshas nafshechem likbor es misim milfonai shemauni ufiguli be'efrom ben sochar v'yiten lias meras machil asher lo asher b'kseisidu b'kesef malei yitenen li. Oh, so once Avraham sees that they are willing to have him among them, then he tells them what he really has in mind. Because it's Avram's idea, right? It's Avram who knows about Ephron. It's Avram who knows about the the land that Ephron owns, and it's Avram who makes the offer to pay for it. Bekesef malei yitnen ali. And then, as we get into the whole formal discussions between Ephron and Avraham, we see that Ephron wants to give it to him for free, like the initial conversation with the Bnei Ches, and Avram insists on paying for it. And so the fact that it begins with Avraham just making that broad request, I want, it's hard to say that Avram intended it to be a gift if Avram was the one who brought up the idea of paying for it. I think what's going on here in these two stages where Avram says, give it to me, and they say, sure, we'll give it to you. And then Avram says, I want to buy that one in particular. What Avram is doing is first demonstrating his standing amongst these people, a standing which is disconnected. He is not one of the Bnei Ches. He is a ger v'soshav, and he doesn't want to be given the land. He doesn't want to be subordinate to them. He doesn't want to remain a ger v'soshav. He very, very, very intentionally, Avram demonstrates that he is a ger v'soshav in relation to the Bnei Ches, and then he says, I want to buy this piece of land, so that he won't be a ger v'soshav in regards to the land. In regards to the land, he will have an achuzas kever. And what he buys isn't just simply a kever, he buys the entire land, the entire field with all of the trees. And so it's clear to me that the point of this story is to demonstrate to us that with the death of Sarah, Abraham recognizes that he is in a new stage of his mission, and that new stage is to ensure that he has a piece of land that belongs to him, that he can pass on to his future generations. It's not a fulfillment of the covenant, but it's an advancement of the covenant. And so what Avram understands, I believe, is that Sarah's death, makes this event important, right? With Sarah's death, Abraham sees that he now must acquire a piece of land to bury her in, and a piece of land to then advance him along the story of his mission. And that leads us right into the other story. The story, because immediately after burying Sarah, right, it says, Avram Zakein Ba Bayamim, Perach Chaf Daled Pasuk Aleph, page 121 in the Steinsaltz, bottom of 108 in the Art Scroll. Avram Zakein Ba Bayamim, right? Avram was old. He was getting on in days. Vashem Beirachas Avram Bakol. He blessed him with everything. Ve'omer Avram Elavdo Zekan Beisom Moshel B'chol Asher Lo Sim No Yelchadash V'Yachov Hashem Elokei Hashemayim Elokei Haaretz Asher Lo Sikach Isha Livni Mibenos Sekanane Asher Nochi Yoshev B'Kirbo. Some of the same elements from the story of acquiring the Marasa Machpelah are present here, in that Avraham contrasts himself with the people around him. By Maras Machpelah, he says, Ger v'soshav anochi imachem. I need my own place. And here, when it's time to find a wife for Yitzchak, he says, Lo sikach isha livni b'bnos ha'kna'ani. I'm not part of these people. And I don't want my future to be part of these people. Ki el artzi ve'el moladti telech v'lakachta ishi livni liyitzchak. Go back to my land, go back to my birthplace, and find me a wife from there. And then we get launched into this whole story with so much, with back and forth, with so much review and repetition of what Avram told to the servant and how the servant conveys that to Lavan. But again, we have this story in which it all could have been summarized in a few psukim, but yet the Torah lays it out. And I think the idea that we learn from Maras Machpelah, we can apply to this story. That this is this second acquisition story is another advancement of the story of the covenant. And Abraham uh, becomes acutely aware with the death of Sarah that this is something that needs to happen now. That Avram now needs to be thinking about his legacy. I'm sorry, I don't like the word legacy in this context. Avram now has to be thinking about the final stages of his mission to advance the story of the bris. What is he going to do to advance that story? And so the first thing was purchasing the land, and the next thing is finding a wife for Yitzchak. And both of these stories, again, highlight that contrast or the importance of that distinction between Abraham and his heritage and the people surrounding him, the people of Canaan that Hashem has clearly rejected. And so Avram knows that he has to buy a piece of land from these people and not be subordinate or dependent on them. And number two, he needs to find a wife from back in his home and not someone from the people around him. And this is exactly what happens. This is with all the back and forth, with all of the detail, the servant of Abraham repeating his instructions makes it abundantly clear, focuses our attention on what exactly Abraham is doing here, and how important it is that he is able to move the story of the covenant along in exactly the right way. And that is, by finding Rivka. And so I believe, going back to Ruth's first question about why this parsha is named Chayei Sarah, and I see I just got another question in the chat, which I'll get to, I'll get to in a moment. The reason why this parsha is called Chayei Sarah, even though I said at the beginning that it seems like the story of Maras Machpelah is more about Avram acquiring an Achuzas Kever than it is about the death of Sarah. Nevertheless, the reason why I believe the parsha is called Chayei Sarah, not just Sarah, but Chayei Sarah, the life of Sarah, even though this is a parsha in which she's not alive, and yet it's called Chayei Sarah, the life of Sarah, is I believe that Avram recognizes that his mission with Sarah has now changed now that she's no longer there. And that everything that Avraham did during the life of Sarah was serving a certain goal, accomplishing things in a certain way, I should say. But now that Sarah has died, Avram now has to prepare for the next generation. That his bond, Avram and Sarah's bond, and their partnership, their sense of teamwork was so critical to who Avraham was. Right at the very beginning, it says "V'sanefesh asher asu b'charan," right? The nefesh that they created in Haran, they created together. The fact that Hashem says "Kol asher tomar lecha Sarah shma b'kolah" shows you how much of an equal partner Sarah was with Avram. The fact that Sarah dies is a clear signal to Avraham that he needs to advance the bris for the next generation, because it's almost as if the main story of the life of Abraham dies with Sarah, and that whatever he does now is future looking. It's not about their mission, right? Their mission is over. The mission is now, their legacy and who comes after them. The question that we got is, after the purchase, where did Avram spend the rest of his life? So if you take a look at the end of the story, after Rivka is brought home, so then in Perek Chayei, in chapter 25, when Avraham remarries and he has more children, and he dispatches those children and gives them gifts and everything else he gives to Yitzchak. So what does it say? So it says, "Ve'ele yemei shnei Chayei Avraham." I'm reading from verse 7 in chapter 25, which is page 133 in the Steinsaltz. And page 120 in the Art Scroll, "Ve'ele yemei shnei Chayei Avraham asher chai me'as shana v'shivim shana v'chamesh shanim v'yigva v'yamos Avraham b'seiva tova zakein v'savea v'yasef el hamav v'yikru oso Yitzchak v'yishmael banav el maras machpelah el sadei Ephron ben Sochar achiti asher al pnei mamrei hasadeh asher kana Avraham meis b'nei ches shama kubar Avraham v'sara ishto." Right, so Avram is buried in the same place, the place that he bought. The Torah reminds us that Avraham bought this place, and that's where he is. That's where he is buried. So what we see from this, I believe, is that Avram is still stays in the same general area, as Marasa Machpelah. I don't believe he lives there necessarily. We know from the beginning of the Parsha that from one of the commentaries, I believe, that when it says "Vayavo Avraham lispod l'Sarah," that Avram comes to mourn Sarah, so he's coming from Be'er Sheva. So it's possible that Avram returns to Beersheba, where he was living before, or perhaps he stayed close to Hebron. It's not clear, but that's the general area where Avram remains. In that southern part of what is now the land of Israel. Okay, all right. We'll stop here. Does anybody else have any more questions? You can either unmute yourself or put it in the chat. But this was good. I'm glad I was able to answer questions and make things a little bit more dynamic, a little more give and take. Again, going forward, you can put questions in the chat window, or you can unmute yourself and ask me. But either way is fine.
Rabbi,
yes?
It's Ellen Slamhouse. I have a question. I have difficulty with the subject being acquisition. It seems to me it's more continuity and heritage than acquisition. Both continuity in the sense of permanently being buried in the land and by continuing the generations.
Yeah, but listen, I agree with you. On a certain technical level, right, Avram does not have an achuzas kever, and he has to get it for himself. Yitzchak does not have a wife, and they need to find him a wife and create that relationship. But it's those acquisition stories that signal a transition. So when you talk about continuity, I would, that's what I mean. Meaning it. See, here's the thing. The only thing I would argue with when it comes to using the concept of continuity is that there's something new going on here. This is a new stage. So you're right. There's a continuity in the sense of perpetuating the bris, but to me, I focus more on the fact that the bris needs to be advanced. Avram has to advance the bris. In order to advance the bris, he needs to accomplish these things. He needs to accomplish finding an achuzas kever. He needs to accomplish finding a wife for Yitzchak. So there, you're right. There is an element of continuity, but to me, it's Avram very actively pushing the story forward. You hear what I'm saying?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you for the question. Anybody else? All right. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you.